Okay, welcome to your skull lecture. So we've got a lot of bones to talk about when we talk about the skull. The skull is formed by cranial bones and facial bones. There's about 20 of those bones, and I have them on the board here. Cranial, your dome skull cap, in the front your face, your facial bones, and in parentheses I have if they're paired or singular. Okay, and I might want to copy that down. Now, we study the bones of the skull individually, but the skull functions as one unit. It houses the brain, the great sensory organs like your eyes, your hearing apparatus, smell, taste, and of course your brain. And what's known as the calvaria, or your skull cap, are three bones: frontal, parietal, occipital. So when you do a craniotomy, you take a bone saw, as we call it. We saw all the way around, we remove it to expose the brain, because that is your brain case. The skull cap, or the calvaria, covers your brain. Also, the skull, cranial and facial bones colored there, it's not so heavy because there's all these air-filled pockets called sinuses, which are mucous membranes. They help reduce the weight of the skull, and they help give your voice resonant sound. And these sinuses are named here, and the picture kind of shows where they are in the skull. If you're in the lab and you had a skull, you could take a pen light and you can shine it right on one of these sinuses, and you could kind of like see how paper thin the bone is, because the light kind of like penetrates the thin bone in those sinus areas to help give the skull a little bit lighter weight. Okay, so I would take a moment and copy those bones down if you want to make a list for yourself. On the next slide, we have the names of the joints that hold bones together in the adult skull. Those are sutures. A suture is an immovable joint. A fibrous immovable joint. It's a type of joint, like your synovial joint, shoulder. I could freely move my arm. This is a joint that does not allow movement between bones. Bones have serrated, sharp edges that fit tightly together, and there are fibers that suture those bones together so they don't move by design. But when you're born, those sutures are spaced out with some cartilage that actually makes the skull a little more compressible, so it's easier to pass the head through the birth canal. And those are called fontanelles in a baby. Cartilaginous or soft spots in a newborn's baby skull. You can see the replacement of the cartilage with bone as you go from baby to adult. And I have a couple of the sutures named on this slide: the Coronal Suture, and the Sagittal Suture. These sutures are named for the anatomical plane that they're in. This is sagittal, and this is frontal or coronal suture, so you should know that. We'll name the sutures when we go over the parietal bone. Well, in terms of a student of anatomy, you should get used to different views of the skull. On this slide, what I did was I just took a bunch of figures like skull. These are great pictures I could use for your quiz or exam. Anterior, this is a view we're all very familiar with. Everyone kind of knows this, even if you don't take anatomy. That's a human skull. Here's lateral view, here's posterior view. And one thing to get oriented with is the top and bottom of the cranial base. study what's called the cranial base. From two perspectives. Superior, inferior. Those viewpoints. This is an inferior view, and we've removed the lower jaw, the mandible. So this is inferior view, mandible removed, cranial base. Okay, that big hole there, your spinal cord's coming out of there. Here's if you remove the skull cap and look down, that's the cranial base from above. This is an important view. Your brain sits right on top of that base, okay? And your skull cap goes over it to protect your brain. So those are views to study. And what I've done is I've given you large pictures to study, and there's a lot of leader lines there. We'll have to know some of those features. And so what I did was I just gave you big pictures to study for all the views of the skull. Again, this is that's your dome, that's your skull cap, your calvaria, made of 3 bones, frontal, parietal, occipital. You remove that to get this view here. This is the superior view of the cranial base. So I did give you some views here. One thing is you should be able to identify bones of the skull articulated, okay? So study the skull bones articulated and disarticulated. When you study skull bones articulated in the skull, the colored figures, the colored skulls help. But also study skull bones disarticulated. But in studying an entire skull, I gave you kind of labels on, labels off from all the views. Labels on, labels off, posterior view, lateral view, labels on, labels off, labels on, labels off. Here's a sagittal view cut through the center of the skull. You can see the plane that they cut in there. Again, labels on, labels off, all the way through. I even have some, again, real skull pictures with the labels on, labels off. Here's our inferior view. I'll just fly through all of them. I'm not going to teach from these. My strategy is to teach you all of those surface features instead of like having this and just pointing to this, and it's hard to see, to kind of like space it out in slides. And what I'll do is I'll talk about each individual bone, disarticulate it, and articulate it, and I'll go through each surface feature one at a time for this video lecture. So we'll mostly go through the PowerPoint slides, studying the bones, how they may look disarticulated from the skull. And you need to know both, be able to identify a bone in the skull, articulated and disarticulated, and all the surface features that are on your study list. We'll start with the cranial bones. I'll do the frontal bone first. Basically, as you can see from this lateral view, the frontal bone is your forehead bone. It's called the frontal bone. It's in the front. It's in the frontal plane. It's your forehead bone. Your forehead. Here's an anterior view of the frontal bone. Okay, and there's one surface feature I want you to know. This, you can palpate right here. Your eye orbit is a complete 360-degree circle, but the top part of it are your supraorbital margins. I want you to know that as a surface feature for the frontal bone. Just know that one surface feature for frontal bone, and of course always be able to identify the frontal bone, whether it's disarticulated or in the skull. The next bone of the calvaria, sorry, I went backwards, not forwards, your parietal bone. So the parietal bone, you have two of them. They form your lateral skull mostly. Two parietal bones. I'll describe them as curved rectangular bones that form lateral skull. Curved rectangular bones that form lateral skull. And you can see it in the picture there, disarticulated on the left and how it fits in the skull on the right, highlighted in green. Here's kind of a superior lateral view, just so you could see the four sides of this kind of curved rectangular bone. And what I want you to know is how this bone with its four sides forms four sutures of the skull shown here. Again, two of the sutures are named for the anatomical plane they're in. Sagittal suture, frontal or coronal suture. You know, more often I see it called the coronal suture, so I'm going to change it to that. So for the parietal bone, know the four sutures. Coronal suture, sagittal suture. The other two are called the squamous suture, lambdoid suture. The coronal suture and sagittal sutures, again, named for the plane that they're in. The sagittal suture is actually forming a suture with the other parietal bone. And then the coronal suture is formed between the parietal bone and then the frontal bone in front of it. The squamous suture is named that because it forms a suture with the squamous region of the temporal bone, as we'll talk about next. The lambdoid suture forms a suture with the bone behind it, which is the occipital bone. And if I could fast forward a couple of slides to show you why it's called the lambdoid suture. In the posterior view of the skull, tell me if you see this shape here. That shape there, that shape there. So this kind of helps form the lambdoid suture. That's the Greek sign lambda, so they call it the lambdoid suture. Okay, know the four sutures. I have a clinical thing to know. I want you to know the clinical significance of the pterion. Pterion means wing of anatomy. It's in the lateral skull, and it's comprised of the union of these four bones here. A little bit of temporal, sphenoid, frontal, and parietal. Those last two we just did. But anyways, the bone is on the sides of the skull is very thin here. It's just superior to the midpoint of the zygomatic arch. And well, it could be life-threatening because it overlies the anterior branch of the middle meningeal artery. That's why it's clinically significant. Thin bone overlying a branch of the middle meningeal artery. So that's significant because if you get a lateral blow to the skull and you fracture those bones, they may lacerate the artery, maybe causing a subdural or epidural hematoma, which is life-threatening. So note the pterion. We'll move on to the occipital bone. Colored in red here, right there and right there, posterior, inferior views of the cranial base. So you can see that the occipital bone forms the posterior and the base of the skull. Occipital bone forms posterior skull and the base of the skull. You can see from an inferior view, that's the bottom. It's got the hole for your spinal brainstem spinal cord to come out. From a lateral view, this kind of reminds me of like a seashell at the beach, has that kind of curved feature. You can see here, what I did was I highlighted the bone in green and I faded out the other skeletal bones, the skull bones. So you can see that it definitely forms the base of the skull as well as the back of the skull. So from the inferior view, that big hole is called the foramen magnum, and your brainstem spinal cord exits there. Foramen magnum means big hole. Brainstem, spinal cord. Exit here. On either side of the foramen magnum are these condyles here, highlighted in green on this picture here. And those condyles are important. They're called the occipital condyles, and they articulate with C1. So be able to identify occipital condyles. They articulate with C1 atlas, your first vertebra. I have a picture of that there. Here's C1. You can see the condyles on the bottom there, and there's how they articulate there. I have a question for you there. What's the joint called? What movement does it allow? It's kind of a review question from the vertebral column lecture. Give you a second to think about that. The answer is, at the lateral occipital joint, the movement allowed is this yes movement. That's kind of what we had said before. So a lateral occipital joint allows PS movement. If you look at this bone from the anterior view shown here, anterior view, and those two little holes underneath each condyle, highlighted in green here, are called the hypoglossal canals. And I want you to know that because those canals allow the exit of cranial nerve 12, the hypoglossal nerve. Hypoglossal canals. CN12, that's XII in the Roman numerals. Well, anyways, we're going to learn the cranial nerves in other lectures, but I'm going to teach you how those nerves exit the skull through the cranial base. And that's why they're called the cranial nerves, 12 pairs. And we'll talk about how they exit the skull today, and I'll teach you their functions later. Well, anyways, there's 12 pairs. This is the 12th one. Cranial nerve 12 is the number. The name is hypoglossal nerve. Exits here. By the name of the nerve, you can tell it's going to go under the tongue. Glossal means tongue. Be able to identify those canals. The last surface feature is called the external occipital protuberance. It's one of the attachments for trapezius. It's palpable. You can feel it on the back of your skull there. Trapezius inserts here, you can feel it. It's highlighted in green, a little bump right there. I'm kind of touching it right here on the back of your skull. External occipital protuberance, know that, and some questions for you before we move on. Number one, bones that form the calvaria. There's three. Frontal, parietal, occipital bones form the calvaria or your skull cap. Your forehead bone, number two, is the frontal bone. Name two sutures named after the anatomical plane they're in. The sagittal sutures in the sagittal plane. The coronal sutures in the coronal plane. For occipital bone, name the structures that articulate with C1 vertebra. Those are the occipital condyles. And which cranial nerves exit on this bone? That's hypoglossal nerve, cranial nerve 12, and it exits the hypoglossal canals. The next bone that forms your lateral skull is your temporal bones. And I got a picture here. It's a lateral view of the bone on the left side because you have left and right temporal bones. But anyways, labels on, labels off. That's a lateral view. And here's an inferior view. Labels on, labels off. You could study. So to orient you with this bone laterally, it's the best way to look at it first. There it is there on the whole skull. Okay. And this skull bone is very irregular and it can be divided into four regions. It's kind of complicated. They make it a point to divide the temporal bone into four regions, and it's color coded here so we can talk about the four regions. I'm just writing that it's subdivided in 4 regions. This flat part here, I've highlighted them in purple just to make it clear. So again, these regions are highlighted in purple. The squamous region, highlighted here in purple, blue here. Anyways, squamous means flat. This is a flat portion of the bone. Here I show you the bone from the anterior view and the lateral view. So when you look at it straight on, you can see that this purple region here it's very thin. It's the side of your skull right there. It's very thin and very flat. Next region, the mastoid region. In the mastoid region, it's basically posterior to your ear. There's your ear hole. So if you feel behind your ear, you can feel that bony tip right there. Okay, that's the mastoid region. And so the portion with your ear hole is called the tympanic region, because that ear canal where you insert a Q-tip to clean your ear canal, well, maybe you shouldn't do that. I don't want you to poke your tympanic membrane because that's where it leads to. And the tympanic membrane, we'll learn about that later. It helps vibrate the ossicles to amplify sound waves so you can hear. Again, that's a later lecture. For now, just be able to identify the tympanic region of this bone. If we look underneath the skull here, there's an inferior view of the temporal bone. Here's how it is fitted on the cranial base, forms the side and part of the cranial base. But anyways, this purple region here is called the Petrous Region. So this part that sticks in, that's the 4th Petrous Region, which means rocky. It's very rough, rocky, not smooth region of the bone, called Petrous. So know these 4 regions: squamous region, mastoid region, tympanic region, Petrous region. To go through all the surface features on this bone, there's quite a few I have listed. The first one is this thin bar that goes anteriorly, highlighted in green. It's the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. So temporal bone, surface features, no zygomatic process. The zygomatic process of the temporal bone, what it's going to do, it's going to help form the zygomatic arch shown here. So the zygomatic process of the temporal bone, it articulates with, highlighted in red, the temporal process of zygomatic bone. Now your zygomatics we'll get to at the end, they're your cheekbones, but they have a process that goes posteriorly to articulate with the zygomatic process. So the process is named for the bone that it articulates with in front of it. So the zygomatic process of temporal bone articulates with temporal process of zygomatic bone. So in this figure, the temporal process of the zygomatic bone is in red. And then the zygomatic process of temporal bone, I highlighted in green, so you're not, it's a little confusing. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense. So know the zygomatic arch. We're going to move on. Next surface feature of the temporal bone is a depression. Fossa means depression. So the mandibular fossa is the name of it. highlighted in green, you got the mandibular fossa. Just to be clear, right there. That little depression, it receives the mandibular condyle of the mandible, and that helps form your jaw joint called the temporal mandibular joint, or TMJ. So I kind of have that term on the next slide, right there. So this depression, this fossa, receives the mandibular condyle, forming TMJ. I rarely write it out. I wrote it out here on the slide, but I usually just call it TMJ, so know that. Next surface feature is your ear hole, called the external acoustic meatus. Sometimes called external auditory meatus. I tend to just call it acoustic meatus, but you should know both because both are used frequently. External acoustic meatus. It's a hole. It leads to your ear canal. I call it your ear hole, but that's not a very anatomical term. Call it the external acoustic meatus. Also know that bump behind the ear, called the mastoid process of the mastoid region, highlighted in green. That's what I'm touching right now behind my ear. The mastoid process. The sternocleidomastoid neck muscle, it inserts on that mastoid process. You should know that. The sternocleidomastoid muscle inserts here. Maybe I'll teach that muscle a little more later. It's your big neck muscle. When I turn my head the opposite way, you can see it pop out there. That's kind of what the muscle does. It turns your head the opposite direction. So the one on the right turns my head to the left. That's why it pops out there. That muscle is running up and inserting behind the ear there. So just know the mastoid process. And moving on. The jugular fossa or jugular foramen. So what I did was I gave you two views. The inferior view is where you see it best. I highlighted this little fossa in green. Now when the bone is disarticulated, all you see is the jugular fossa. But when it's articulated in the skull, it actually forms a hole in the skull called the jugular foramen, with the other half of the hole comes from the occipital bone. So in the skull, call it the jugular foramen. If it's disarticulated, call it jugular fossa. What I want you to know about this is the internal jugular vein exits here. There's other cranial nerves that exit there actually too. We'll talk about those later. But for now, know that internal jugular vein exits here. Sometimes I abbreviate internal jugular vein, IJV. And I just have a picture of it on the next slide showing you. The red arrow here is pointing to the jugular foramen. The red arrow here is pointing that big neck vein is basically draining the entire brain, and it's going to go all the way down, and it will return blood to the heart. Well, anyways, internal jugular vein is the main vein of the neck, and it exits the jugular foramen. So know that. And there's a canal right next to that jugular fossa. The jugular fossa still highlighted in green, right next to the carotid canal, highlighted in red. Now the carotid canal goes from here to here, goes through there, right there. What I want you to know that carotid canal is the internal carotid artery enters the skull there. So I say enters and exits. I say that the IJV exits there because blood is being drained from there, going down to the heart. But I say this artery enters there because arteries distribute blood, so blood is flowing up. So frequently arteries and veins run together, but blood is flowing in opposite directions. Veins return blood to the heart, arteries distribute blood away from the heart. You'll learn more about that in cardio. For now, just note the carotid canal. The carotid canal, pronounced carotid, but for some reason it's spelled carotid. And anyways, this is where the internal jugular vein, it enters the skull there. You can see that it's pretty obvious from this picture. Internal carotid artery enters skull through this canal. Okay, so that's what I want you to know. Here's a lateral view of the internal carotid artery, and it's entering right there. Where I put the red arrow is kind of where it enters, and you can kind of see it in this picture. ICA, internal carotid artery, isolated and in the skull. And one last picture, again, screenshots from the app. Both ICA, internal carotid artery, for short. And here it is, the IJV coming out of the jugular foramen by itself there. Okay. Now one last view for the temporal bone. This is a medial view. So remember, if we're talking about a medial view, we're looking inside the skull. So just to orient you, this is the Petrous region, that's the Squamous region, okay? And so what I did for the app was because this picture is always confusing to students, I hit the parietal bones so we could see inside the cranial base, and I highlighted the temporal bone in roughly the same orientation in green so we could kind of see what we're looking at when we look at this by itself. All right. Now, what I'd wanted you to know, you're supposed to know the zygomatic process. I do want you to add to the list the internal acoustic meatus. They call it internal acoustic opening. I call it internal acoustic meatus. You don't have to know the styloid process. The meatus is a sort of opening. Anyways, what I want you to know, here's another view of the cranial base. It's kind of busy, but these are all the cranial nerves exiting the cranial base. This one highlighted in purple, exiting the internal acoustic meatus. That's cranial nerve 8. Okay, that's one of the cranial nerves. I want you to know that exit there. Cranial nerve 8 has a name. It's the vestibulocochlear nerve. There's another nerve that exits there, but I don't know if I have it highlighted on the picture. Facial nerve. That's cranial nerve 7. So these cranial nerves exit the internal acoustic meatus. 7 and 8. We're going to move on from the temporal bone to the sphenoid bone, a singular bone on our, let me write it on the board here. The sphenoid bone, kind of a bat-shaped bone. Here it is inside the skull. This is the superior view of the cranial base. You can see it's right next to the temporal bones in orange. Here's the frontal bone in yellow. There it is there. There it is isolated. There it is kind of color-coded. Now, I'm pointing to this little saddle called the sella turcica, which is a surface feature of the bone. And that little depression, which resembles, I guess, that's a word that means Turkish saddle. This is roughly where the pituitary gland sits. That's where you can find it, so it's important to know. Pituitary located in the sella turcica. Again, that means Turkish saddle. Here's another view of the sphenoid bone. This is an anterior view. Again, from the anterior view, you can see why people call it like it looks like a moth or a bat. Beautiful bone, shaped like this. Looks like a bat. It's one single bone. There it is. Kind of, you can kind of see how it like is in the skull there. This little fissure, I put a red line to red line, so you kind of orient. This matches to that, so you can kind of see how it fits in the skull. What I did for the app was I highlighted the sphenoid in green, so you can kind of see how it's literally behind your eyeballs here. Also forms part of your lateral skull. What I did here was I just kind of highlighted it in green and kind of faded out the skull, so you can kind of really see how this bone is really deep inside the skull there. So to look at it by itself, the first surface feature of what you know are things called the greater wings. These greater wings, which are highlighted in purple, compare this view to this view. All right, I want you to see that the greater wing, it helps form part of your lateral skull. And from the anterior view, you can see how part of the greater wing, it forms the back of your eye orbit. So I'll say posterior eye orbit. Greater is a relative term. There's a lesser wing, and it's highlighted in purple there. Here's our superior view of the cranial base, so you can see how this wing, this lesser wing, helps form part of the cranial base. Lesser wings form part of cranial base. Now, the cranial nerve has a lot of openings, canals, and foramen and fissures. And what I want you to see with the sphenoid bone highlighted here in green, that there's a lot of nerves that exit structures here, and we have to go through those. So the first one I have listed there is the optic canal. So the optic canal, the optic nerve highlighted in purple there, exits the optic canal. Well, it's going to go to the back of the eyeball. It actually conveys sensory information or vision. That's important. So the information is traveling this way, going into the skull, because the brain, the occipital lobe of the brain is back here. That's for vision. But the nerve is up there. So for the sphenoid bone, note optic canal. Optic nerve, cranial nerve 2, exits there. Sorry, that's a 2. Probably looks like something else. Roman numeral 2. Optic nerve is the name. Know the optic canal. Know the superior orbital fissure seen here. Right there. This cranial nerve is cranial nerve 5. And what I've highlighted in purple is the trigeminal ganglion. The trigeminal ganglion of the trigeminal nerve. So basically, the trigeminal nerve, cranial nerve 5, the name is trigeminal, implies 3. what's highlighted there is a ganglion, which gives off 3 branches. So the trigeminal ganglion of the trigeminal nerve gives 3 branches or 3 divisions. Okay, that's what I want to outline next. That first division is the, we call it V1, it's the ophthalmic division, and it exits the superior orbital fissure. All these are, well, this one will go to the eye. Okay. That first branch, I don't know if you can see it. Study the slides close up. That's a little branch coming out there. I have it highlighted in purple. So first, note superior orbital fissure. It's a fissure right behind the eyeball. So a lot of nerves that exit there are going to help innervate different parts of the eyeball, and we'll detail it later. Now let's just list the names. Superior orbital fissure. The first division of these 3, call it V1 because it's cranial nerve 5. V1, the name is ophthalmic. Like the ophthalmologist or eye doctor, that nerve is going to the eye. It exits the superior orbital fissure. The next hole, I'm pointing to it there, is the superior view. Right there, that little hole there, and this purple nerve there exiting there. It's a round hole. It's foramen rotundum. V2 exits there. Remember, foramen means hole. So V2, that's called the maxillary division. The maxillary is, your maxillary bone is right here. Well, anyways, that's basically your face. And this nerve goes to that region of the face. So it's called the maxillary. Let's call these divisions, not nerves. They are nerves, but just to call them divisions to remind you, it's the 3 divisions of trigeminal nerve. So the nerves are divisions. And the last one, foramen ovale right there. It was hard to highlight, but that's V3, the mandibular division, going to your lower jaw. The maxilla is your upper jaw, the mandible is your lower jaw. And that's the foramen ovale. Pronounced ovale, but spelled ovale, but it's for the opening for V3. The mandibular division. We'll go over the functions of those nerves later. I'll be able to identify those holes. There's one last little tiny hole. It's called the Foramen Spinosum. I'm pointing to it on the left there. Here is an artery that enters there, highlighted in purple. The arteries are red here. By the way, there's ICA coming into the skull. You'll learn about that later. I want you to know that the middle meningeal artery enters the skull via the foramen spinosum on this sphenoid bone. That's an opening for middle meningeal artery, the same one I mentioned before that could get lacerated by the pterion. All right, here are some questions for you. Four regions of the temporal bone, excuse me, squamous, mastoid, tympanic, petrous. The process behind your ear, mastoid process, your ear hole, external acoustic meatus. The mandibular fossa forms the TMJ with the mandibular condyle. The IJV exits the jugular foramen. The internal carotid artery enters the carotid canal. The pituitary sits in the cella turcica. The three divisions of cranial nerve 5. V1, ophthalmic, exits superior orbital fissure. V2, maxillary division, exits foramen rotundum. V3, mandibular division, exits foramen ovale. For this C question here, the answer is right there. The middle meningeal artery enters the foramen spinosum. Moving on to the ethmoid bone. The ethmoid, it's a very small bone. In this picture here, in this colored skull, you can see this very small bone in the cranial base right there. I blew it up here. So note the ethmoid, and from the superior view, you can see the first surface feature are the cribriform plate with the olfactory foramina. The ethmoid. You know the cribriform plate, but that plate has holes. So I'm going to say with olfactory foramina, which means tiny holes, because through those tiny holes, cranial nerve 1 olfactory fibers will kind of enter those holes. Cranial nerve 1 olfactory nerve fibers, they exit there. Little holes in that plate. Here's a blown up view, so maybe you can see the cribriform plate with the holes a little bit better. Blank figure. Here's cranial nerve 1 right there. Here's a lateral view. So one thing you have to know is here's the plate and there's the bulb, but the bulb gives off the fibers. Those tiny little olfactory fibers are what I'm talking about here. They're the ones exiting the holes through that plate for the sense of smell. There's the olfactory epithelium, which houses these fibers, and when you smell, those little odor molecules get caught on the nerve endings and trigger the sense of smell. Okay. Here's another view of the ethmoid. There's the ethmoid, there's cranial nerve 1. You can see this is the nasal septum. You can see that the nasal septum is partly bony. So when we say bony nasal septum, it's this part and this part. This is the cartilaginous part of the nasal septum. You have two nasal cavities, one for each nostril. Another surface feature is called the Crista Galli. The Crista Galli is this little shark fin right there. But it actually means cock's comb. That's what it looks like. It's a little bony protrusion. It anchors the falx cerebri, which is basically a connective tissue that stabilizes the brain and the cranial cavity. So note Crista Galli. Which means cock's comb. And there's Mr. Rooster. There's the Crista Galli, the cock's comb. I can't draw. I said functionally, this little protrusion anchors the falx. The full name is falx cerebri. So I'll give you that term now. You could look it up. We'll talk about it and get to the brain. The falx cerebri basically anchors the brain in place. Also know the perpendicular plate highlighted in green on this figure. As you can see, it forms the superior bony nasal septum. vertical plane, this perpendicular plate. And I said it forms your superior bony nasal septum. Here's an anterior view of the perpendicular plate, highlighted in green, inside the nose there and there. And from this front view, you can see that the ethmoid has all these little air turbinates. Well, not this one. These ones and these ones. And there's ethmoidal sinuses in there too. It's tiny flakes of air pockets, flakes of bone creating air pockets, I should say. And I want you to know the middle concha. Now, there's superior concha, middle concha, inferior concha. And all these concha are these little bony air turbinates. First note, middle concha. There's two of them. The E pluralizes it, but anyways, I describe them as, they're usually described as bony air turbinates. It's an odd description, but what's happening is when you breathe air, the nose is part of the airway. The mouth is not, although you can't intubate through the mouth to get to the airway. The nose is the proper airway. And when you breathe through your nose, air gets filtered through these bony air turbinates, the superior, middle, and inferior nasal conchae. And it breaks up the airflow. It helps slow, warm, humidify air. It's just good for breathing overall. So these bony air turbinates function to break up the airflow, which is a good thing. Slows airflow. Helps to warm, humidify air. This is the air that you're inspiring. Anyways, I have the middle concha on your study guide. Now we're going to move away from the cranial bones to the facial bones, and we'll start with the biggest bone of the face, your lower jaw, your mandible, shown here. The strongest bone of your face. The mandible is your lower jaw, it's your chin. So you have, as you can see in this figure, mandibular teeth. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15. Okay, yeah, you have 32 adult teeth, 16 in the lower jaw, 16 in the upper jaw. And, well, let's go through the parts. Here's labels on, labels off for you to study. You know, I'll go through the surface features one at a time. The basic parts, first you have the body of the mandible, highlighted in purple here. Purple, okay, that's the key color there. And here is it uncolored. I know it's kind of hard to look at things all colored up. It's kind of weird. Uncolored versus colored. The highlighted portion is what I'm talking about. So the body of the mandible in purple is the U-shaped part of your jaw. It's U-shaped. It's the main part. Whenever they call something the body of anything, it's the main part. This is the main part of the jaw. Now the part of the jaw that sticks up, we call the ramus. Ramus means arm. So this arm of the mandible sticks up on either side, highlighted in purple. Okay? You know the ramus of mandible? Be able to identify that. And the tips of the ramus, you have the mandibular condyle there, highlighted in purple there. Again, the mandibular condyle forms TMJ. It goes in the mandibular fossa there. The other pointy process there, highlighted in purple, is the coronoid process. Coronoid means crown, so shaped like a crown, I guess. Temporalis muscle inserts here, pulls on that coronoid process. I thought I'd show you a picture of that in the next slide. The temporalis muscle closes the jaw, so it's lining up when it closes the jaw. It's called the temporalis muscle, has a large attachment on mostly the temporal bone. I'm going to zoom in there so you can see the temporalis muscle. It's grabbing that coronoid process right there, and it's pulling up on it as you close your jaw. So the temporalis muscle closes the jaw, it inserts on the coronoid process. I hope you can see that from that video clip from the app. The alveolar process of the lower jaw. Alveolar means tiny air sacs. There's flaky thin bone creating tiny air sacs for your tooth sockets. So the alveolar process is where you find your tooth sockets for your mandibular teeth. So again, alveolar process highlighted in purple. It's for where you find your tooth sockets. Mandibular angle in purple there. You can palpate it. Just follow your jawline to the back corner of your jaw. Okay, that's the mandibular angle. It's where the body and the ramus meet. I'll say it's palpable. Back corner of your jaw, where body and ramus join or meet. Okay, that's how I'll describe it. A couple of holes here. The mandibular foramen, mental foramen, note those. So remember that branch, V3, the mandibular division of the trigeminal nerve? V3, mandibular division, gives a branch called the inferior alveolar nerve. It's going to enter that mandibular foramen. So V3 itself is a branch, which can get off another smaller branch, gives off the inferior alveolar nerve, enters mandibular foramen, and once you get inside there, you're going to run along on the inside of the jawbone for your lower teeth. And then eventually you're going to give off another branch called the mental nerve. It's going to exit the mental foramen there. I have a picture of it right here. So here's V3. It's exiting the foramen ovale. It's giving off a lot of branches. This big branch here entering the mandibular foramen is running through the jawbone there. It's going to give off another branch called the mental nerve, which exits the mental foramen right there. So this is how you can feel your toothache, right? I mean, you can, like when you chew food, you can feel things. You can feel food in your mouth. You have sensation there, okay? And of course you can feel a toothache. And then you can feel your lower jaw here because, and a branch of inferior alveolar nerve is mental nerve. Mental nerve, another branch, exits this little hole here called the mental foramen. And that nerve, mental nerve, helps you feel your lower jaw. So you got the mandibular division, that's a nerve. Inferior alveolar nerve is a branch of that. Mental nerve is a branch of that. All right? And they just go through from boom to boom. That's why I want you to know mandibular foramen, mental foramen. Some questions for you. Where does cranial nerve 1 exit? The olfactory foramina on the cribriform plate. Which structure anchors falx? Crista Galli. The concha are bony turbinates that break up airflow, help to warm, slow, humidify air that you breathe in through your nose. The course of the nerve branches through the mandible. All right, basically, boom, right there, that's the answer. Your tooth sockets are in your alveolar processes. Which condyle forms TMJ, the mandibular condyle? Where does the temporalis muscle insert? Coronoid process. We'll move on to more facial bones here. Here's the maxilla and the palatine bones. Now the maxilla I'm pointing to, or colored orange in this picture here. Your maxilla is basically your central face, and it also forms the upper jaw. You got two of them. Two maxilla form basically central face, upper jaw. So you got maxillary teeth there. Your other 16. If you look at the inferior view of the cranial base right there, you can see that these processes which fuse in the middle, those are the palatal processes of maxilla. They form the anterior 2/3 of your, what we call your bony roof of your mouth, the hard palate. Palatal processes of maxilla form basically anterior 2/3 of the bony hard palate. You have soft palate, but this is talking about the hard palate, the bony roof of your mouth. The horizontal plates of the palatine bones form the posterior 1/3 of your bony hard palate. Horizontal plates those are palatine bones. Form posterior 1/3 of bony palate. So, no palatal processes of maxilla, no horizontal plates of the palatine bones. Those are two bones for you there. Here's a sagittal view of the skull. You could see maxilla, the bony hard palate there and there. So you could see that the arrows pointing to the horizontal plate in a cross-sectional view there. I'm also pointing out vomer, this bone here. Vomer is a bone. The word means vomer, plowshare, I guess. Kind of resembles a plow right there. But note the vomer bone inside the nasal cavity. Means plow. Basically, I guess it resembles a plow. The function is it forms the posterior, or sorry, not the posterior. It forms the inferior bony nasal septum along with the perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. So the vomer is highlighted in red. So it means plow. I guess it resembles a plow. I'm not a farmer, but I imagine a plow looks something like that. Forms inferior bony nasal septum. So you should be able to identify the vomer by looking at here in the nose. There it is there. There's vomer, there's the perpendicular plate. Here from the inferior view, you can see the vomer sticking out right there. So let me go back a slide. So again, here's vomer. It's going all the way back there. So if you look from the bottom right there, you should be able to see the end of that from the inferior view. That's what we see there. We'll be able to identify a vomer. You also have the lacrimal and zygomatic bones in this slide. Zygomatics are your cheekbones. It's kind of the lay term. The scientific anatomy word is zygomatics, your cheekbones. And here's a lateral view of your cheekbones. You can remember previously we said that they help form the zygomatic arches. Remember, the zygomatics have a temporal process. That helps to form zygomatic arches. Here's that slide we looked at earlier, okay? But I'm going to go back to where we were. Zygomatic bones. The smallest bone of the skull, lacrimal bones, found in your medial eye orbit. On this colored skull picture, the light blue color there, the lacrimal bones. Located on medial eye orbit. Functionally, they receive tears. They even call tears that accumulate in the medial eye the lacrimal lake. The lacrimal bone receives tears and passes them on to the lacrimal sac, which actually drains down to your nose. That's why you get the sniffles when you cry. Anyways, we'll learn about the lacrimal apparatus there. Just be able to identify that bone right there. Also, you got your two nasal bones, which technically form the bridge over your nose, where you put your glasses on. So be able to identify nasal bones, bridge of your nose, you put glasses on. Here's the inferior nasal conchae. They're inside your nasal cavities there. You have superior and middle nasal conchae, which are part of the ethmoid, but the inferior nasal conchae are their own bone. You can see them inside the nasal cavity there. So be able to identify inferior nasal conchae. Technically not part of the skull, but I'll just kind of throw in the hyoid there on top of the larynx. It's part of the axial skeleton, technically not part of the skull. I can't remember if I've mentioned it before, and you do need to know the hyoid. The hyoid bone has the distinction of not articulating with any other bone. It's the only bone that does that. It does not articulate with any other bone. No other bone is by itself like that. All of the bones articulate with bones. And that's the end of your skull lecture. I hope you enjoyed it.